Good afternoon and welcome to the next installment in the Kirby Institute seminar series. And today we're having a presentation from the winner of the Postgraduate Student Prize, Mohamed Hammoud. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, particularly the Darwell people where I am today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be joining us today. So some housekeeping issues to start off with. The format is as usual with these seminars. We'll start off with a presentation and that will be followed by a Q&A in the end. The best way to do that is to enter the questions by typing into the Q&A box throughout the talk. To do this, you click on the icon with the speech bubble and a question mark in the top right-hand corner to open the Q&A chat screen. When you click on Ask a Question, please remember to write your name. This will help us to reference your question and make answering the question easier. You can upvote or support any question you like that you would preferably like to be answered. And you can change the order of questions by clicking on the tab in the top right-hand corner of the Q&A chat, which says most recent, and changing that to most liked. So as I said, today we're having a presentation from Mohamed Hammoud, who is the winner of this year's Kirby Institute Postgraduate Student Prize, which is an annual prize which we award to the most significant first author paper by a Kirby postgraduate student published in the previous year. And this year, this was awarded to Mohamed for a paper that he published in JADES in 2019 about the uptake of PrEP in gay and bisexual men. And I'll leave him to give the details of that, but this paper arose and formed a significant part of Mohamed's thesis, PhD thesis, which he was awarded early this year. Currently, Mohamed is a research fellow with the HIV Epidemiology and Prevention Program, and as I said, completed his PhD this year. And his current research focuses on illicit and licit drug use among gay and bisexual men, HIV and STI, PrEP, and the impact of COVID-19 on HIV prevention, illicit drug use, and mental health. So I'll hand over with no further ado to Mo for a presentation that I'm really looking forward to. Over to you, Mo.
Thank you, Tony. I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. I hope so. Before I start, I'd like to say how truly humble I am to be the recipient of this award. And I'd really like to acknowledge all the other candidates because I know the enormous hard work they put into their PhD research projects. Funny story, Garrett, my primary PhD supervisor, suggested I submit this publication to be nominated. I don't usually say no to Garrett, but I don't because he's a scary man. But with this, I protested because I honestly believed I'd have no chance to be the recipient of this award. Just like with every other debate I've had with him, he won. So reluctantly, I submitted and refused to give it another thought. You can imagine my surprise when I woke up to an email from Tony congratulating me that I was a recipient of this award. Yeah. Since then, since receiving the award, I've been thinking a lot about my short experience as a researcher, and two things came up that I'd like to share. First, I'm fascinated that so many participants engage in our research and how their input shapes our future. So to the 4,000 men who took part in the Flux Study since 2014, thank you for sharing your experiences. They provided me with the data to write my PhD, and which included the publication that was awarded. The other thing that came up is the power of our collective networks. So I wanted to say thank you to a few people. Thank you to the Flux Study investigators, all my co-authors, Team HEP, and everyone at the Kirby Institute for your collective intelligence, interest in my work, and modelling high-quality research. To our community partners who bring our data to life. To the executive team for selecting my paper. Can't believe hard work pays off now. To my adorable family, and finally to my PhD supervisors. Jeff June, thank you for everything you've taught me, for always being available, for always checking in, and for always doing so with your infectious smiles. And lastly, to the grumpiest person at the Kirby Institute, my primary PhD supervisor, my mentor, Garrett Prestage. For the first year of my PhD, I was petrified of this man. I mean, honestly, who wouldn't be walking into this guy's office? It took me a very, very long time to realize that behind this scary man is actually one of the most kindest, most generous, and the most caring men I have ever met. Although I get the attention for this award, the real winner here is Garrett. Not only for his supervision, but for everything he's done that no one else sees, and for everything he's done for me before he even knew I existed. So Garrett, thank you for creating a world where I get to be me. Thank you for agreeing to be my supervisor. Thank you for your grumpy encouragement to submit this nomination. And thank you for giving me the tools to continue the work you started. Most people know I passionately hate presenting, so I'll gracefully accept my punishment for winning this award and begin my presentation. So the paper that was awarded a postgraduate student prize has formed the basis of several presentations, including a couple of Kirby seminars. So instead, I'll present a high-level overview of my entire thesis, of the main findings of my thesis, but I'll highlight the paper when I get to it. The primary focus of my PhD research was to investigate HIV-related risk among gay and bisexual men who engage in chemsex. My thesis was somewhat timely. I was in a unique position to look at HIV risk before and after the widespread availability of PrEP. To illustrate this, I'll divide my presentation into 4 sections. The first will cover how I formulated my research hypothesis. The second, which is made up of 3 chapters, looks at drug use and HIV risk before the availability of PrEP. The third section, which is made up of 3 more publications, looks at how HIV risk has changed since the introduction of PrEP. As I present my results, I'll discuss what they mean, but for the 4th section, I'll summarize my final thought. I did have 2 further publications as appendices, one that looked at changes in behaviour following PrEP initiation, and the other that goes into more detail about mental health among men who use drugs. I'll only mention them briefly as they relate to the results in this presentation. And just before I begin, just a quick disclaimer. While I do acknowledge that problematic drug use among gay and bisexual men may need to be addressed, it was beyond the scope of my PhD research. But in the Flux study, which gave me the data, we do look into this. So, in the beginning, how did I formulate my research question? When I began my PhD research, we knew that the HIV epidemic is concentrated among gay and bisexual men in Australia. We also knew that HIV transmission was exacerbated by engaging in condomless anal intercourse, sex with casual partners, having a high number of sexual partners, and engaging in group sex. Moving forward, I'll refer to those as HIV sexual risk behaviours. HIV transmission was also exacerbated through the use of licit and illicit drugs, which, when compared to other factors, seemed to be the one that carried the most risk. Remember these factors because I'll use them to measure against the results I found in my research. With drug use standing out, I decided to have a closer look at it. Previous literature has consistently found that gay and bisexual men use drugs at much higher rates compared to their heterosexual male counterparts, most of which focused on individual psychological factors for motivations of use, which included the effects of homophobia, sexual abuse, social isolation, and more commonly, minority stress, most of which assumed a causative link. Interestingly, there wasn't much research that looked at the pleasures of drug use, but it had started to emerge. Regardless of what was published, all the literature on drug use had one thing in common: the associations with HIV risk. This is best described through my supervisor's previous work on the HIM study. To illustrate the association between drug use and subsequent HIV infection, I'm going to focus on 2 drugs, one legal, one illegal. So compared to men who didn't use drugs, men who used methamphetamine were twice as likely to HIV seroconvert. Not too surprising since we already knew this in the literature. But among men who used erectile dysfunction medications like Viagra, they were 4 times more likely to HIV seroconvert. The first thing this highlights is the common misconception that illegal drugs carry more risk. Among men who use both erectile dysfunction medications and methamphetamine, they were 8 times more likely to HIV seroconvert. Even though the HIM study found that EDM use had higher odds, methamphetamine was the only drug listed for PrEP access at the time. The guidelines have since been updated, but I'll speak to the guidelines that were available during my research. So, from an epidemiological perspective, we already knew these associations existed before I started my research. This questioned whether the focus may not be on the specific type of drug use, but rather the context in which the drugs are used. So, what was the context gay and bisexual men used drugs? Social behaviours are heavily influenced by the cultural and societal norms that exist in a given time and place. This could suggest that drug use among gay and bisexual men may also reflect normative values that exist within a gay community subculture. Commonly, the high prevalence of drug use among gay and bisexual men has been attributed to adverse mental health, but what was clearly missing was the pursuit of pleasure. Drugs commonly used to enhance sexual pleasure is referred to as chemsex and party and play. The term chemsex has become synonymous with problematic drug use, with many suggesting that gay and bisexual men who engage in chemsex are motivated by psychological vulnerabilities. Assumptions like this are exacerbated through national and international media using sensationalist language. The stigma associated with the term chemsex could have unintentional consequences that may impact an already stigmatized population. Although the term party and play has been historically used in Australia, I chose to use chemsex throughout my thesis to counter some of the sensationalism and misrepresentation that all gay and bisexual men use drugs, and among those that do, to refute the simplistic assumption that drugs are solely motivated by psychological vulnerabilities. The effects of drugs commonly used in chemsex, such as methamphetamine, increases the level of sexual excitement, may disinhibit impulse control, and impair risk judgment. To some degree, this might explain the higher rates of HIV infection among gay and bisexual men who use drugs. But before PrEP, the HIV risk associated with drug use wasn't new knowledge, yet there had been little change in HIV epidemiological trends in the decade before beginning my research in 2014. This might suggest that HIV prevention strategies at the time were inherently limited as they applied to gay and bisexual men who engaged in chemsex. So the question is, will the introduction of PrEP break the association between HIV risk and pleasure? With all that in mind, and holding a position of harm reduction, I approach my thesis from an epidemiological perspective to understand the factors that exacerbate HIV risk, and a socio-behavioural perspective to understand the context in which this risk occur, which informed my research question, which was, to what extent do gay and bisexual men who engage in chemsex remain at risk of HIV acquisition in the context of chemsex, in the context of PrEP, sorry. So that's how I formulated my research question, which informed the first chapter of my thesis. To address the research question, I set up a national cohort study of listed and illicit drug use among gay and bisexual men. I intended to capture men with varying degrees of drug use, including non-use, to get a more detailed understanding. Guided by my supervisor's work on the HIM study, I paid attention to key chemsex drugs. At the time of this analysis, it was EDM use and methamphetamine use. Launching in 2014, over 2,000 gay and bisexual men across Australia joined the study. Since then, men respond to 6 monthly questionnaires, which collects data on the use and non-use of drugs, the reasons they ascribe for the use or non-use, measures of dependence and mental health, sexual health, community connectedness, and so on. Overall, the men in this sample were similar to other samples of gay and bisexual men in Australia and in similar countries. The first thing I noticed about the baseline result is that not all gay and bisexual men use drugs. Shocking. About 1/3 had used amyl or cannabis in the previous 6 months, and less than 1 in 5 reported the use of a known chemsex drug, such as methamphetamine. What was more interesting was the prevalence of concurrent use of the key chemsex drugs. Among men who reported methamphetamine, EDM, or amyl use, 38% had used a combination of these drugs. At the time, GHB wasn't included in this analysis, but I'll explain that when I get to chapter 4. To summarize my chapter 1, these results kind of suggested that the use of drugs might be in the context of chemsex, but further investigation was warranted. From the HIM study, we saw that the odds ratio for using EDMs carried higher odds than methamphetamine use, so this curiosity informed my next chapter. I investigated the context of EDM use. I investigated the context in which EDM was used and the extent to which its use might represent HIV risk. This analysis was also before PrEP became available in Australia. Overall, most men in this sample didn't use EDM, and among those that did, most reported using it once or twice in the previous 6 months, most of which described using it to enhance sexual pleasure. There was only a small number that ascribed who said their use was for therapeutic purposes and that were using it at least on a weekly basis. In logistic regression, I compared men who did not use EDMs to men who did. Those who used EDMs were more likely to be socially engaged with other gay men, more likely to report HIV sexual risk behaviours that were identified in the introduction, and more likely to use illicit drugs to enhance sexual pleasure, including the use of methamphetamine and GHB. There was no associations on measures of mental health when comparing men who used EDM to men who didn't. Based on the results, these men ascribed for the use, the factors associated, and the similarities of these factors are found with methamphetamine use in other samples of gay and bisexual men. I concluded that EDM use was primarily used in the context of chemsex, and its use was associated with behaviours that represent HIV risk. Based on these results, I questioned whether other drugs carry the same risk and whether they should be considered alongside methamphetamine use, which inform my next chapter. But before I get into that, the data used to inform the PrEP guidelines were collected in the mid-2000s. At that time, the prevalence of GHB was low among gay and bisexual men in Australia. Since then, the prevalence of GHB had been steadily increasing. At the time of this analysis, there was very little published on GHB use, with most publications not having a representative sample to draw conclusions. So I investigated whether men were using GHB, the context of its use, and the extent to which it represents HIV risk. In 2017, the sample size increased to 3,200 men. And again, but not too surprising, most men had not used GHB. About 20% had used GHB in their lifetime, and 8% of the entire sample had reported any use in the previous 6 months, with most using it once or twice. The reasons ascribed for its use were explicitly to enhance sexual pleasure. In logistic regression, compared to men who did not use GHB, those that did were more likely to be socially engaged with other gay men and more likely to report HIV sexual risk behaviours. In a separate analysis, they were also more likely to use drugs, including EDM and methamphetamine, to engage in chemsex. And there was no association on measures of mental health when we compare men who don't use GHB to men who do. The associations for GHB use mirror what was found in EDM, and which in turn mirrors what was found with methamphetamine use. So it looks like men in our sample were primarily using GHB to engage in chemsex, and their use was associated with HIV sexual risk behaviours. The results highlight two potential limitations of the PrEP guidelines. Firstly, the guidelines at the time. Firstly, methamphetamine is not the only drug used by gay and bisexual men to engage in chemsex, nor is it the only drug associated with behaviours that represent HIV risk. The guidelines were based on data that was collected in the mid-2000s when GHB was attracting less attention. So it probably didn't reflect HIV risk behaviours at the time. Secondly, most gay and bisexual men reported infrequent drug use. Mostly are reporting once or twice in the previous 6 months. Data collected from the HIM study, which informed the guidelines, also collected behaviours in the previous 6 months, but the PrEP guidelines specified behaviours in the previous 3 months, which would also question the sensitivity of the guidelines and their potential accuracy. Building on that, the main question I had at this time was, were gay and bisexual men who are at high risk of HIV accessing PrEP, or were they hidden in plain sight due to these limitations? This question obviously informed the next chapter. At the time of this analysis, PrEP was mostly accessed through implementation trials in Australia. In this chapter, I used cohort data from 2014 to 2018 to investigate whether behaviours that correspond to the PrEP guidelines that were reported in the previous round subsequently predict PrEP initiation. I then restrict the analysis to men who meet the eligibility criteria to see what was associated with the non-use of PrEP. This is the publication that was awarded the Postgraduate Student Prize. I'll describe the results of this publication in the context of my thesis, and then I'll talk a little bit about the publication. So among all non-HIV positive men, compared to men that did not initiate PrEP, those that did were more likely to report behaviours in the previous round. So the behaviours they reported in the previous round, they were more likely to be socially engaged with other gay men, and more likely to report the same HIV sexual risk behaviours that are found with EDM use and GHB. But they were also more likely to have reported behaviours that correspond with the PrEP guidelines, which included condomless anal intercourse with HIV positive partners not on treatment or had a detectable viral load, and more likely to use methamphetamine. This analysis was based on the entire sample, regardless of their eligibility status. So there was a rapid uptake of PrEP among men who engage in chemsex and among those who met their PrEP eligibility criteria. While these results were promising, there remained about 1 in 5 men who were still reporting high-risk behaviours by the definition of the guidelines that did not subsequently initiate PrEP. In the next analysis, I attempt to identify these men. So I restrict the analysis to men who meet the eligibility criteria to see what factors was associated with the non-use of PrEP. So compared to men who met the criteria who were using PrEP, men who weren't using PrEP were less likely to be socially engaged with other gay men, less likely to report HIV sexual risk behaviours, and less likely to report behaviours that correspond to the eligibility criteria. The first thing I noticed about these results is that they're the same factors that that are associated with EDM, GHB use, and the same factors that predict PrEP use, but in the reverse order. Now, the interesting part of these results, there was no association for methamphetamine use among high-risk men who weren't using PrEP, but those who reported using drugs other than methamphetamine to engage in chemsex were less likely to initiate PrEP. So to say it another way, among high-risk men, those who initiated PrEP were more likely to be reporting the use of other drugs rather than methamphetamine. The other thing these results highlight is even though most men not using PrEP were less likely to report these behaviours, they were still engaging in behaviours that place them at risk of HIV, just doing so less frequently and less consistently. But from a harm reduction perspective, even a one-off event can pose risk to HIV transmission, which might have otherwise been avoided by the use of PrEP. Oh. So this was the paper that was awarded the Postgraduate Student Prize. Submitted this paper. Through this publication, we were able to challenge aspects of the PrEP guidelines, including the interpretation of their high-risk definition and the sensitivity to capture high-risk men, limitations that could have potentially exposed at-risk men to HIV. Worth noting, Garrett and I submitted and received the Gilead Fellowship Grant, which provided us with the resources to explore this topic in greater detail, which is how this paper came to be. The results of this paper also informed several new research questions, which supported 2 early career researchers to lead publications using data from the Flux Study. Dr. Steve Philpott, extended these findings to lead two publications. The first was a qualitative analysis looking at participants' perception of PrEP use among all non-HIV positive men in the context of high accessibility. And his second was a mixed methods approach that looked deeper into the reasons ascribed for high-risk men not using PrEP. I haven't presented it in this, I haven't shown the data in this presentation, but that publication also looked at PrEP use and non-use among men who didn't. Let me start again. It also looked at PrEP use and non-use among non-high-risk men, so they didn't meet the criteria. We looked at what was associated with their use and non-use. Based on those findings, it informed soon-to-be Dr. Philip King's publication that demonstrated PrEP use is associated with a reduction in HIV anxiety among gay and bisexual men who are at high risk of HIV. But it also informed one of Garrett's publications that looked at changes in sexual behaviours among men who initiated PrEP. Slightly off topic, kind of. The last two publications I mentioned showed that PrEP wasn't only protecting men from HIV, but it was also allowing them to have the sort of sex they wanted. Also, once men started using PrEP, their sexual behaviours changed. They were having much more sex, but the use of methamphetamine didn't change. So the assumption that PrEP use will lead to more drug use, the answer is no. Because of this, Garrett and I developed a methodology to automatically collect data in cohort data, and because it did a fairly good job with the Flux Study, it has since been expanded to New Zealand, so Flux New Zealand, which is led by Peter Saxon at the University of Auckland to collect similar data. And in a couple of months, it'll launch a similar study in Australia, looking at drug use among lesbian, bisexual, and queer women at NDARC, and the study is called Unleash. Since this nomination, it's also been adapted to the SMASH study in Scotland, which is similar to the Gay Community Periodic Survey in Australia, but they're turning it into a cohort study. And also, since then, it's been adapted to several COVID studies within and beyond the Kirby Institute. That basically covers my submission. Moving on. Coming back to the results of this publication, although men who are not using PrEP were less likely to be engaging in behaviours that place them at risk of HIV, they are still engaging in the same behaviours, just doing so less frequently and less consistently. So this obviously informs my next chapter. At the time of this analysis, the prevalence of PrEP use had increased to about 28% in my sample. The HIM study demonstrated that there was an increased likelihood of HIV acquisition among men who use both meth and EDM. In this chapter, I build on my supervisor's previous work to see if men in my sample who are using both drugs were also using PrEP to mitigate against the risks of HIV. First, I restricted the analysis to men who were using both meth and EDM to see what factors were associated with PrEP use. So among the men using meth and EDM, compared to those not using PrEP, those who were more likely to be socially engaged with other gay men and more likely to report HIV sexual risk behaviours. For the most part, men who were using both drugs were also more likely to use PrEP. Yeah. In the next analysis, I restrict the next analysis to all PrEP using men to see what factors were associated with the use of erectile dysfunction medications and methamphetamine use. So compared to all PrEP using among all men using PrEP, compared to men not using meth or EDMs, those who were also more likely to be socially engaged with other gay men and more likely to be engaging in HIV sexual risk behaviours. So what does all this mean? It means that for the most part, men who are engaging in chemsex, specifically those using EDMs and methamphetamine, were more likely to be using PrEP to mitigate against the risks of HIV. When we compare the findings from the HIM study to these results, we find that a subculture of men who were once at highest risk of HIV are now using PrEP to reduce or remove the risk of HIV infection. Although these results are promising, there remains a proportion of men who are using both drugs but not using any HIV prevention strategy. Regardless of all that, these data to this point were collected during a time where PrEP was accessed through implementation trials, so it hadn't been listed for public subsidy. What we didn't know was whether these results will remain true outside of when it was listed for PBS. Which obviously inform my next chapter. We know that methamphetamine use has been consistently linked to HIV infection, and at the time of this publication, it was still the only drug listed for PrEP access. Associations between methamphetamine use had not been tested in the context of biomedical HIV prevention, especially during the time when PrEP implementation studies had begun to wind down. So in the final chapter of my thesis, I go full circle to the original question: is methamphetamine use associated with HIV risk, but now in the context of PrEP outside of trials? So similar to what I found with EDM use and GHB, most men in this sample had never used methamphetamine. Among those that did, the reasons they ascribed were explicitly to enhance sexual pleasure, often in the context of chemsex. Compared to men who didn't use methamphetamine, those who did were more likely to be socially engaged with other gay men and more likely to report HIV sexual risk behaviours. There was no association on measures of mental health when we compare men who use methamphetamine to men who don't. But for the important result, men who were using methamphetamine were more likely to be engaging in HIV sexual risk behaviours, but also more likely to be using PrEP. Men who weren't using methamphetamine were more likely to be engaging in HIV sexual risk behaviours without the use of any HIV prevention strategy. If we compare that to the men using meth, only less than 8% of those using methamphetamine were engaging in HIV sexual risk behaviours without the use of any prevention strategy. So for the most part, men who were using methamphetamine were more likely to be biomedically protected from HIV. Unsurprisingly, methamphetamine was primarily used in the context of chemsex, and almost all their HIV sexual risk behaviours were protected, which would mean that within chemsex networks, most men were protected. This is a massive shift from just a few years ago when men engaging in chemsex were the most high-risk group among gay and bisexual men. So methamphetamine may no longer be a reliable indicator of HIV risk. Man, I'm running through this. This brings us to the fourth and final section of my presentation. I've already discussed what each chapter means, but I'll leave with my final comment. In my thesis, I demonstrate a shift away from the previously highest risk practices due to the incorporation of PrEP among gay and bisexual men who engage in chemsex. Since 2014, it is clear that many men in this sample derive clear, if subjective, pleasures from drug use. PrEP offers a harm reduction opportunity that can be usefully deployed among men who engage in chemsex. My results emphasize the need to reinforce the message that the use of any drug, licit or illicit, in sexual settings or the frequency of HIV sexual risk behaviours should involve some HIV prevention strategy. I thought I'd have no time left, but what I haven't spoken about is the factor of being more socially engaged with other gay men. Being more socially engaged with other gay men is an indicator for engaging in risk, but it's also an indicator for HIV prevention and harm reduction. These are the same patterns that we found in the early HIV epidemic with condom use. The whole point I was including it is to highlight the importance of the role of the gay community plays in HIV prevention and harm reduction. But I might do it for another seminar. And just my final comment, the guidelines that I used during my thesis have since been updated. The updated guidelines have now been expanded to include drug use in any sexual setting, or any sexualized setting, and it does highlight the use of GHB. But they've also included HIV anxiety, which is great. And that's it. I finished far quicker than I expected.
Thanks, Mo, for a terrific presentation. So we have some questions here. I guess I might, and please add those questions to the Q&A by typing into those. There's quite a few comments around whether Garrett's scary or not. And I guess that's a debate that can be ongoing. Could I just, on those latter points that you made in your talk there, could you tell us a little bit more about the demographics of your population, particularly given that, you know, a lot of the issues with controlling new infections in HIV seem to be related to perhaps minority communities, and so how reflective of, you know, what percentage of your survey populations arose from those sorts of communities?
Very hard to access those communities in our research samples.
Yeah.
So they're not really that represented. This is very much a gay community connected sample. So most people were aware of HIV prevention. Among the men who are HIV positive, they were mostly, for the overwhelming majority, were on treatment. Accessing those hard to reach populations and trying to identify, so there weren't many. I mean, there were, I think it was about 88% that were Australian born. So that's, don't think my data can actually speak to those populations.
Right. And the other thing that I guess intrigued me in those, in your early data sets or your early data analysis was that of the association between high risk behavior and the use of either EDM or methamphetamines, and what you thought the drivers of that were. You know, I guess generically or simplistically, people might think that the use of those, particularly the methamphetamine, might cause disinhibition, and therefore people were more likely then to take risks. But that's wouldn't be what you think would happen with the EDM. So would you like to speculate on cause and effect here between the use of these drugs and high risk behavior?
Just from what I've seen, that gay and bisexual men are mostly using drugs to enhance their sexual pleasure. With EDM, it's a hard one. I mean, it makes sense because if you're using methamphetamine, one of the side effects is erectile dysfunction. So you use erectile dysfunction to counter the effects of methamphetamine. I didn't really explore into great detail impaired judgment. There was a lot of literature about it, but it helped me guide if that's one of the reasons why, then what can we do to help? What's one harm reduction perspective? I was surprised with the ADM being more at risk, but I suppose it still makes sense. It's a drug used specifically for sex. You know, it's not to go partying with friends. The motivation for ADM use is to have sex.
Okay, so apart from the commentary on Garrett, most of the other question that Fran raised was really around about the representativeness of the general gay men population. So I guess you've sort of already addressed that, but
yeah, I mean,
have you got any other comments on that?
It's similar to other samples. So the sample was similar to the HIM study. It's very similar to the gay community periodic survey data. It's similar to other samples, but we are missing the culture that we can't, the subculture that we can't grab. The men who are born overseas, the Asian born men, the Middle Eastern born men, they don't come through these data sets. It is a problem, and I know it's been an ongoing discussion ever since I started, but it's really hard to get these men.
Have you got any ideas of how we might do that? Because I think it's absolutely critical for these sorts of studies, but also for just getting the prevention messages out there, right?
It is absolutely critical. Hands are always tied with limited funding and who's going to lead the research. So I've got a PhD student starting with me this year who is looking, his whole project is to focus on Middle Eastern men. How does he get these men to engage in research? How do we know what's going on? We don't know. But it takes a whole project to look at these one population. It can't be done in little side pockets. If it's going to be done properly, someone needs to really focus on it. With the Flux study, the focus was drugs. So it wasn't about community connect. It wasn't about the at-risk populations. It was drug use in Australia. What's going on? Ideally, we would have liked to go into it, but again, we had limited funds, which is the whole reason my methodology started, was to have a way to save funds. But if anyone's willing to do a PhD project, I'm happy to supervise them.
So then we've got another question here that says, given that gay community engagement has historically been a strong indicator both of risk and of access to preventative strategies, does this have any implications for how that's considered?
It does. It's I mean, if I knew I'd finish earlier, I would have kept it in the presentation, and I discuss it in greater detail in my thesis. It's in my thesis, I question the interpretation of the gay community survey and how we've interpreted the data. It does predict harm reduction. It does predict risk. So it's a bit more complex. You know, I mean, of course, it influences behaviours, but it's the same. It's the same kind of two sides.
Okay.
I think it needs to be much more nuanced than what I could cover in my PhD thesis. But it is fascinating.
So Virginia asks, after congratulating you on your presentation, can you say more about what's happening in other countries and their prevention strategies?
New Zealand, the prevention strategies with PrEP aren't as prominent as ours. They've only got through one survey, and funding dependent, they'll run another survey, but that's not looking good, so I can't really talk about causation. Scotland, it's still collecting data, so that should be finished in a few months. Similar, again, so high prevalence of drug use, mostly used in the context of sex, and their PrEP is not as good as Australia's, but it's creeping up there. And with the lesbian and bisexual queer women, we will know by the end of the year.
Is there anything you would have changed about how you've approached your PhD?
Oh, gosh, there's so much. Yeah, there's a lot I would have. Well, I like the approach I took. I like the epi and I like the socio-behavioral. Would I do it again in a heartbeat? Would Garrett let me do it again with him? Probably not. Probably would have went into more context, like far deeper into the how culture influences behavior.
Okay. And you know, just to ask a technical question, so you know, your mechanisms of data collection have clearly made an impression and have had significant uptake by other studies. Do you want to just do a 2 to 3 minute spiel on what that involves for people who might not know about sort of impressive things you've done with that?
Okay. So when I first started, we were running a Flux Study, a cohort study of, we were expecting 1,400 men. And the whole point was to measure individual changes in behavior against each survey. And if a behavior changed, we wanted to know why it changed. And we wanted to ask questions about that change. You don't do that manually. To me, that's a computer's job. In a past life, I had software engineering experience, and I just thought this should be automated. At the time, there was no platform that would do it. So Garrett secured funding through New South Wales Health to develop it into a standalone system. So pretty much once you set up the study, assuming it doesn't evolve, assuming it doesn't have changes, you don't need to look at it again. It sends the reminders. If they've answered the question, if they've finished the survey, it stops it, it invites them to the next one. So it's just like a little robot that does it for you. As the study evolves, you touch it. It was adapted for the COVID studies, but the hospital's ethics would only allow REDCap. UNSW was trying to adapt it into REDCap. There are some, in my opinion, really basic limitations that REDCap should have, but we've found a way to make it work. UNSW infrastructure has actually requested that some of the modules we've developed for these clinical trials be shared with other institutes at university. How do I get around these limitations? We get our own license at the Kirby. Mm-hmm. It means coming with someone full-time maintaining the database. Mm-hmm. But what we can do with it is far more than what I've done so far. Yeah.
Okay. And so there's been another question. So do you think the rate of chemsex might have reduced during these COVID-19 times?
I can tell you absolutely has. I'm just about to publish the paper on it. Significant drop in drug use and ongoing bisexual, specifically due to COVID. But it was also accompanying a significant reduction in sex, which is what you'd expect, and also a significant reduction in the use of PrEP. All COVID related. So the main reason for you stopping the drug use was because of COVID. There are still a group of men who continue to use drugs, but they're still using PrEP. So for the most part, it has reduced. And I mean, there's a worry in that, because if their tolerance levels drop and they start doing it, and so this is what the publication looks at. Once they pick it up again, what's going to happen? What harms are associated there?
Right.
And the other thing they came up was purity, drug purity, and its quality and all that. So there are some concerns that need to be looked at and need to be addressed before the world opens up again.
Okay. So Mo, thanks for a really terrific presentation, which was very clear and obviously very topical, and I think very important for a lot of people across the Kirby. So thank you very much, and congratulations again on winning the award. We look forward to some really good submissions for this year for the award next year. So I'll close there. Thanks very much, everybody, for attending.
Thank you.
And we'll talk either in person or virtually soon. Bye.